So at the very end of day 5, they did a voir dire for the first officer on the scene to the John O'Keefe murder scene or death scene. I don't know what you call it. Homicide. And this I put together to show what happened with Officer Link. We heard all about him yesterday, and this is just basically to show his history of brotherhood with the Canton police over the last 20 years at least.
Why, dear, I thought that we would have finished this earlier and I'd be able to give you more time, but...
And he's going to harp on this was so long ago. That actually cuts against the Commonwealth's case. That shows how long these folks have been involved with each other and how deep their relationships run. For him to sort of deputize himself in that situation in order to help out his longtime friend, whom he socializes with, drinks with, grew up with, establishes a bias and a prejudice, in this case against Miss Reed, and in favor of the Alberts. And it's not like he had a tangential part to play in this, a role to play in this investigation. He was the very first officer to walk in that front door. He absolutely knew what he was going to find when he walked in the front door, which was the homeowners and possibly other witnesses. He engaged in a interview or a series of interviews that were not recorded. I have no idea what was said. The jurors are never going to find out exactly what was said other than to take his word for it. I'll start over.
Sure.
Do you know who Tim Albert is?
I do.
And do you know who Chris Albert is?
I do.
And do you know who Brian Albert is?
I do.
How do you know Tim Albert?
I know Tim Albert to be one of the younger brothers of the Albert family.
How long have you known Tim?
Since childhood.
What about Chris Albert?
Yes, I know Chris.
How long have you known Chris?
Since childhood.
And how would you describe your relationship with Chris Albert?
Chris and I were pretty good friends growing up, right into our 20s. Still friendly when I see him.
Still socialize with him?
No.
When did you last socialize with Chris Albert?
I couldn't tell you the last time I personally socialized with him. I've seen him at events, but Chris and I don't make arrangements to go out together.
What about Brian Albert?
No.
How would you describe your relationship with him?
Civil. We were friendlier back then, yes.
Right. Back in 2002 in August, while you were off duty, were you out either drinking with Chris or in some way at a restaurant or a bar with Chris?
Chris actually approached my vehicle and started to describe an altercation that he had been in previously in the night.
When you say your vehicle, your personal vehicle?
Yes.
Okay, so you were off duty, is that right?
Yes.
You've been drinking?
Yes.
Nothing wrong with that, but just so happens that you've been drinking that afternoon.
Yes.
Ultimately, when you realized that Chris Albert was in some sort of fracas, some sort of fight or altercation, you activated yourself as a police officer at the time.
He wasn't in a fracas when he approached my vehicle. He approached my vehicle and stated that he had been in an altercation earlier in the night with one of the Lapalato brothers, and that during that altercation, threats were made against him and his family, and he was seeking advice because he knew as a police officer as to how he should go forward. And as I was telling him what to do, that's when a group of men started to walk down Washington Street towards Chris, and he said, "Oh no, here they come."
So that would be Mark Lapalato, correct?
Yes.
And his brother, Alfred?
Yes.
You got out of your car and approached the other men?
Yes.
You also called for a Canton police backup?
I brought my attention to the restaurant owner and a bartender who had walked out into the street, and I yelled for them to call the Canton police.
Canton police did, in fact, arrive, correct?
They did.
Isn't it true that after you got involved and Canton police arrived, you then instructed some of your colleague police officers to handcuff Alfredo?
I can't recall.
Isn't it true that after Alfredo was handcuffed and, for all intents and purposes, physically incapacitated, you then approached Mark Lapalato?
No.
You got into a fight with Mark Lapalato, though?
Yes.
You punched him in the face?
At one point after he had struck me, yes.
So your story is he struck you first, and then you punched him.
Yes.
His story, of course, is you punched him first.
I don't know what his story is.
Well, you were sued in federal court, and he told you his story in that lawsuit, correct? Did you testify at that criminal case?
I did.
All right. The allegation that Mark Lapalato made against you is that you punched him, took him to the ground, continued to beat him, and bit him to the point of drawing blood, correct?
I believe that was his allegation, yes.
He then indicated that once the police officers that were there pulled you off of him, you then turned and walked over to Alfredo while he was still incapacitated, meaning physically handcuffed, and spat in his face.
I believe that was his allegation, yes.
Ultimately, both men, after this altercation, were allowed to leave the location, correct?
I believe one fled and the other one was allowed to leave, yes.
Okay. You're telling me now that Mark Lopalito punched you first, a police officer, correct?
Yes.
And are you aware of any circumstance in which an individual would be able to punch a police officer on duty or off duty in the presence of other police officers and just be released? That wouldn't happen, would it?
I don't believe the other police officers were on scene when the fight initiated.
Did you tell them that you got punched?
I don't recall.
So the next day, Mark and Alfredo showed up at Canton PD to file a complaint against you and some of the other police officers that were involved, correct?
That's what I was told. I wasn't there.
You didn't file a report for assault, or battery, or anything like that, correct?
I spoke with my sergeant that night, and he said that I could do the report when I came back in on my next day of work.
My question is, on that night, did you file a report?
No.
The next day, did you file a report?
I don't recall if it was 1 or 2 days later.
It's actually 3 days later, wasn't it?
I'm not sure. I honestly couldn't tell you. It's 22 years ago. I'm not really sure.
But between the time this fight happened and you filed a report, Mark Lopalito and his brother Alfredo came into Canton PD and asked to swear out a complaint against you and fellow officers, correct?
I believe so.
And they were told to go away on that day.
I couldn't speak to that.
By the time they came back to file the complaint, then police reports had been written, right?
I don't know.
Once those police reports were written, after they indicated that they wanted to file a complaint, ultimately charges were brought against them, correct?
Again, ultimately charges were brought. I don't know the exact timeline.
After charges had been brought, and both brothers ended up having to go to court and defend themselves, you ran into both brothers at a mobile gas station.
Yes.
You confronted both brothers, correct?
No.
Isn't it true that you walked up and said, "How you doing?" to the two guys? And one of them responded, "Not so good. You attacked me, and now I've got to go to court."
No,
Conversation?
I believe they initiated the conversation with me.
Did you say, "How are you doing?"
Something to that nature.
And did they respond? Something to the effect of, "I'm not doing so good because you attacked me, and now I've got to defend myself in court"?
I don't recall exactly what they said in response.
And then, based on that interaction, you arrested them for witness intimidation, correct?
Well, there was further interaction. It wasn't just the response to "how are you doing?" They made threats, and they were ultimately arrested, yes.
So your claim now is that they made threats against you, a sitting police officer at the time, a working police officer?
Yes.
Okay. And you reported that threat to the DA's office?
Yes.
A report was brought against them for that witness intimidation, correct?
Correct.
Ultimately, with regard to the assault charges for which they were arrested and tried, they were found not guilty in a public adjudication criminal case, correct?
Correct.
And the DA's office threw out the witness intimidation charges because they were meritless. Isn't that right?
The charges were thrown out.
So all of this situation emanated from you coming to the aid of Chris Albert, your friend, longtime childhood friend, correct?
It had nothing to do with it being Chris Albert.
So just a regular random guy off the street, you would have conducted yourself the exact same way.
Absolutely.
Sergeant Lank, in that particular circumstance, was you came to the aid of a friend and you used your position as a police officer to further that assistance and that protection?
No.
And this issue, or the investigation where charges were brought against Tim Albert, that was a circumstance in which Tim Albert, in broad daylight, slammed into a parked car belonging to a woman and then fled the scene, correct?
No.
Didn't you follow a trail of transmission fluid or something to find where he had gone?
I did.
And he fled directly to 34 Fairview, correct?
Correct. I concluded my investigation by locating the vehicle that had heavy damage.
Right, the vehicle that he hit.
His vehicle.
His vehicle had heavy damage, but so did the vehicle that he hit, correct?
So you had said a minute ago that he hit a parked car. That's incorrect.
Oh, he hit a moving car.
It was a vehicle that was, I believe it was stopped at a light. It wasn't a parked car. It was a vehicle that was stopped.
Okay. Irrespective of whether the engine was running or parked or not, he hit a car with a woman in it, fled the scene, then you find him trying to hide out at 34 Fairview, correct?
He had parked the car at 34 Fairview.
And you didn't have much choice. I mean, there you have it. The evidence is right in front of you. You can't really cover that one up, right?
I would say I did my job.
Your Honor, move to strike.
So this is voir dire. Could you answer the question, please?
I would say I did my job.
Okay. Did you engage in any kind of a DUI investigation?
We spoke with him.
Did you give him FSTs?
I don't recall if I did. I know I didn't. I don't recall if Officer Good did.
Did you give him a breathalyzer?
I did not.
Did you ask him for a blood test?
I did not.
So no DUI investigation was really undertaken, correct?
Again, I can't recall what Officer Good did, but I was there.
But you didn't do it. You didn't do what I just suggested, a full-blown DUI investigation.
No.
Even though he hit another car and then fled the scene.
We spoke with him, and he gave an explanation.
And that explanation coming from Tim Albert was, I'm really sorry I panicked, right?
It was something to that nature.
And he turned around, well, I'll just cut to the chase. Y'all ended up charging him with a misdemeanor, correct?
I believe so.
And he was given diversion?
I don't know.
And his record was wiped clean?
I don't know.
That's all I have.
I don't disagree that some of this is admissible. I just have to figure out how you intend to get it in, because I have to be concerned about if it's a mini trial within a trial, and we're trying to avoid that.
And it is essentially a trial within a trial at this point. Bringing in other civilian witnesses to talk about an incident which happened 22 years ago to
So
involving...
let's forget about bringing in the civilian witnesses. How about what we heard as to what Sergeant Lank would testify to?
As to what Sergeant Lang would testify to is a single incident in which he did not witness anything to do with the Albert brothers. Christopher Albert was never at 34 Fairview Road on January 28th or until much, much later in the day of January 29th, and certainly not at the same time that Sergeant Lank was. I think counsel far overestimates what Sergeant Lank's involvement in this particular investigation was. He shows up on scene. He assists with the other officers, Lieutenant Gallagher and Sergeant Good, that you've already heard from. And with respect to, he takes a couple of initial statements who all those witnesses then subsequently talked to troopers from the state police. So any purported bias from an incident from 22 years ago involving a brother who wasn't even present at the home on the night in question does nothing but confuse the jury as to what the issues are, and creating this sort of bias out of thin cloth that has no basis whatsoever in the facts of this case.
Okay, so I disagree with you. I don't know yet. I want to see those police reports. If it weren't involving the Alberts, then under the grand jury case, the decision by Justice Gantz, Chief Justice Gantz at the time, it wouldn't come in. But it does, so it comes in for different purposes or different reasons.